Hello, welcome to the 2024 Everything You Need to Know About Formula 2 season. So Formula 2 in 2024 was very exciting, had a lot of amazing races, it's had a little bit of controversy. Generally it was very interesting, a lot of good races. And if you really like Formula 2, then this is the video for you. That's all here, everything we need to discuss. So let's start off with some stats. We've got the 2024 average pole was 1 minute 34.674, and the fastest qualifier, that's across 5.276 kilometres. The fastest qualifier is Gabriele Bortoleto, 1 minute 34.962, with an average speed of 200.013 kilometres per hour. The slowest driver of all the drivers that competed in every race, Rafael Villagomez, 1 minute 36.007 seconds, and he's 1.045 seconds slower than Bortoleto, or averaging 2.177 kilometres an hour. He's the slowest of the original bunch that started the season. That's a very tight grid. To imagine that across qualifying for an entire season in F2, that the fastest qualifier and the slowest qualifier are separated by 1 second. That is an incredibly tight field. Now, sometimes when you look at Formula 2, the data you look at, the results you look at don't tell you the full story. But if you dig, then you'll find a lot of quality information that can tell you how certain drivers have performed. And looking at the feature race standings we have, so this doesn't include the sprint races. Now, why haven't I included the sprint races? Because the nature of the reverse grids means that drivers that are not the fastest are being rewarded, and it doesn't tell you the full story. So the full story is that Gabriele Bortoleto has won this championship by 5 points over Hadjar. They have a decent gap to Paul Aron in third place. Then there's a tight bunch. Zane Maloney in fourth with 99 points, though he didn't complete the season. Richard Verschoor with 93. Andrea Kimi-Antonelli with 93 as well. Jack Crawford with 81. Victor Martins with 74, Joshua Dirksen with 69, and Franco Colapinto, who only did the first 10 races, finishes 10th on 66. Because Zane Maloney and Franco Colapinto had their seasons cut short, this is a hypothetical amount of points they would have scored had they continued. So doesn't change the position for Zane Maloney. He's scored a couple of more points. He's a bit closer to Paul Aron. Franco Colapinto has come up from 10th and he's scored 92 points. He's in the mix for 5th place. Now there's some interesting stats. So a lot of the commentary on the 2024 F2 season has told us that, and even I just said it's very tight, it's very close. Apparently it's very random, 18 different winners. That's a stat they love to throw out there. However, half of those winners are in the sprint race only. And here are some interesting stats that tell us a different story about the 2024 season. 40% of all feature race podiums are scored by 3 drivers. I want to repeat that. The feature races are the most important. They're a true reflection of where drivers are in terms of their ability, and 40% of all feature race podiums have been scored by 3 drivers. and that's the top three in the championship: Gabriel Bortoleto, Isaac Hadjar, and Paul Aron. If we extend that to the top 6 drivers, as we see here, which includes Maloney, Verschoor and Antonelli, then these 6 drivers have taken 64% of all feature race podiums. So that seems to indicate that these 6 drivers have done a marvellous job and have had the measure of the other drivers generally, although with Jack Crawford having 3 podiums, you could assume that he's also part of it. But yeah, it just goes to show that when you look at when you dig into the numbers, there's data telling us that certain drivers have done a very good job, and it's not just random, and it's not just haphazard. Some other interesting points: the same 3 drivers that finished top 3 in the championships, Bortoleto, Hadjar and Aron, have taken 38% of all the feature race points. And they have taken 1/3 or 33% of all top 5 finishes in the 14 feature races. So these 3 drivers have been very instrumental in this season. And as I said, if you look at the top 6, they've taken more than half of all the top 5 finishes, more than half of all the points. You have to consider what this data means on the back of, reliability issues, the amount of crashes we have, safety cars changing the results. That's remarkable. That means, I think in particular, Bortoleto, Hadjar and Aron, they've done a remarkable job. They have done very well and they have dominated. But the domination is not by a lot in terms of time. If we look at the feature race pace, we can see Gabriel Bortoleto has really gapped the field. He's had more than 2/10 on the next fastest driver, which is Paul Aron, who is almost a 10th faster himself than Isaac Hadjar. Victor Martins is the 4th fastest driver in feature race pace. And then behind him is a tight bunch from 5th through 10th. And we see a couple of surprise drivers here. We see Antonelli, Colapinto, Crawford, Behrman, who finished outside the top 10, but his feature race pace is there fairly close to Antonelli. We'll say see Enzo Fittipaldi. That's a surprise to see him in the top 10. And Zane Maloney is very close to Enzo Fittipaldi as well. I think he's 4,000 slower. So that upper midfield bunch that comes after Victor Martins, Antonelli, Colapinto, down to Maloney, even past, it's very tight. A lot of drivers are quite competitive, but as you can see, Bortoleto has absolutely nailed it in terms of his feature race pace, and Paul Aron is a clear second. So these 2 drivers have done the best job. Like Bortoleto's done the best job, and Paul Aron has done the second best job in terms of feature race pace, and that's probably close to being the most important thing. The most important thing when it comes to analysing Formula 2. And if we look here, there's a lot of different teams here. So it shows that maybe in previous years, ART or Prema or whoever had a pace advantage. Whereas here we see in the top 10 are the drivers with the fastest race pace. We see that they're from 9 different teams, and the only team that is represented twice is Prema, which is half a surprise and not a surprise because Behrman and Antonelli are very highly rated drivers, so it's not a surprising statistic, but it is in a way that that it's viewed that their car was struggling. Do I think that Gabriel Bortoleto is 0.4 of a second faster than Antonelli or 5.5 of a second faster than Behrman? Probably not. Maybe the Invictus hooked up, maybe, but Bortoleto has definitely made the most of that car. And what have we got here? This looks at the teams specifically, and this is feature race. Now, this is very interesting. This tells us that Invicta was the fastest car, and the Prema was only 17 thousandths of a second behind the Invicta. Campos and ART also within 1/10 of a second across 14 rounds of the championship in feature race pace. That is incredible. These cars are incredibly close, followed by MP, Dams and Hi-Tech all within 2/10. These cars are very evenly matched. We've got 7 teams that are very close. I think Hi-Tech suffer a little bit with one of their drivers being Amaury Cordeel, who's not quite as fast as the lead driver Paul Aron. Dams, I don't think Juan Manuel Correa is as slow as some people would assume. ART have a solid lineup. Campos have a solid lineup. Prema have a solid lineup. Invicta, Cushmine is a little bit slow, but he's fairly solid too. Now, Rodin, is that team genuinely going slower, or is that to do with the drivers? Well, we know Zane Maloney's a great driver in Formula 2. When it comes to Ritomo Miyata, maybe he's struggling a bit to adapt to Europe. I don't think he's that slow. I'll come to AIX in a second. Van Amersfoort, obviously, I think that their numbers are slow because Rafael Villagomez is not the fastest driver. I feel as though their numbers are impacted a little bit. But with Trident, I think both Roman Stanek and Richard Verschoor are pretty solid drivers. So I think, looking at this, that Trident genuinely had a slower car compared to the other teams. And maybe some team like Van Amersfoort, Rodin, Dams, maybe they're not quite, but they're almost but not quite on the same level as the other teams. Obviously with setup differences, some teams will maximise at some tracks, other teams will maximise at other tracks, but it seems as though the new 2024 ground effects car has washed away the advantage that some teams had. As for AIX, I think that they also have a car that is slower than the competition in the feature race pace, because I have to tell you, I think that Joshua Dirksen and Taylor Barnard are 2 very good drivers, and to see them 3/10 off Invicta is, I don't think that Dirksen or Barnard are 3/10 of a second a lap slower than Gabriel Bortoleto and Cushmine. So I think that car might be struggling a bit. Now, it's here twice, AIX. I've omitted the results of Chien Shields and Niels Coulin to get the AIX adjusted. Why have I done that? Because in spite of what we say about drivers like Cordeel or Villagomez, they're still of a decent standard, but these 2 drivers, Niels Coulin and Chien Shields, are not on the level that is required to compete in a proper way in Formula 2, and including their results, and they've only done 4 rounds between them, has really affected the AIX car's perceived pace. So it does show how much a driver can affect the perception of a car's pace. But yeah, I think it's unfair on the AIX squad to include their results, although AIX chose to put those 2 drivers in the car. In qualifying is a different story. Now, this qualifying pace might go some way to explaining why Invicta and particularly Gabriel Bortoleto have done so well and why they seem to dominate the stats. They have more than a tenth and a half of a second on the next fastest team, which is MP Motorsport, which is a little bit of a surprise because the top driver for them in the championship was Franco Colapinto in ninth. Obviously, he didn't finish the season, but he was running as high as sixth at one point, I believe. Hauke seemed to struggle, but I think the drivers that took over, such as Oliver Goethe and Richard Verschoor, they looked quick. So I'm surprised MP are that high up in the qualifying pace. Prema are very close, which is a surprise and not a surprise. Maybe Prema's not. Their problem this year may not be so much the car as it is having a clean weekend. ART is fairly close, but I have to question the gap between Invicta and ART. If I look at Gabriel Bortoleto and Kush Miney and I compare them with Victor Martins and Zach O'Sullivan / Luke Browning, I don't see a great difference in quality in drivers. I don't believe that accounts for 2/10. So I think, looking at this data, that the Invicta car has definitely had a pace over the other teams in the qualifying. And if you're starting up the front, as we know, clean air is king. That's been very beneficial for Gabriel Bortoleto. This is where maybe the race pace of the Invicta wasn't quite domination, but the qualifying pace was, and it's taken the pressure off. When you're starting in the top 4 or 5 drivers every weekend, you don't have to worry too much. I think Campos also, maybe they've struggled with qualifying. It's put them on the back foot because I think that Marty and Cadjo are a quality pair of drivers. High-Tech being 0.3 of a second off with Cordeel there. You know, whatever you want to say about Kush Miney, I think he's a lot faster than Omri Cordeel. So I think High-Tech could be up there with Prema and ART in terms of the qualifying pace, or maybe even in front of MP. But the problem for them is that they have Cordeel. Roden are a little bit slower. Dams, but I don't think that Miata or Correa are as slow as Cordeel. So maybe these two teams in qualifying trim are not quite on the level of Invicta or MP. Maybe they're about two. Maybe that team hasn't quite got the qualifying set up. I think Jack Crawford struggled a lot. He's not a bad driver. I think Van Amersfoort, they have Villa Gomez, so maybe that drops him a bit. He is the slowest qualifier of the original 22 drivers that started the season, and that's a fair drop. Now, Trident, as I said, they don't really have any bad drivers, so to me, I think Trident have the slowest car both in qualifying and race pace. And AIX, as you can see, then in 9th place, there's the adjusted version without the results of Chen Shields and Niels Coulin. So in qualifying, just having those two drivers for the last 4 rounds has impacted them by 0.6 of a second. So it goes to show that the drivers do make a difference, their qualifying form. I think that AIX have a better car than they did last year, but I don't think it's one of the top teams, especially in qualifying trim, because these results, the 0.495 seconds, is attributable only to Taylor Barnard and Joshua Dirksen, 2 very good drivers. So to see them half a second off Invicta, I'd rate both of those drivers ahead of Kush Miney, if I'm being honest. So I think that AIX don't have the best car. I think maybe they're the 2nd or 3rd slowest car on the grid. That's some of the stats to look at that give you a a deeper understanding of what's been going on in Formula 2 this season. We're going to look now at the season driver by driver, starting with Luke Browning. Luke Browning came in for the last 3 races in the ART team, compared to the fastest qualifier of the season, which I'm just going to, spoiler alert, Gabriel Bortoleto. He's the fastest in the qualifying and the race pace and the ultimate pace. The ultimate pace is basically an average of the qualifying pace and the race pace. Now, I understand that the race pace should be more important than the qualifying. Maybe you think I should give it a higher weighting. However, the race pace that I'm talking about also includes sprint races. So that data I looked at before, where I showed you that Gabriel Bortoleto is on the top, Paul Aaron is second, and he's 0.232 seconds off Bortoleto. That was feature race pace. But this race pace includes an element of sprint races, and this is not an absolute pace. This is compared to the fastest driver, who I explained is Bortoleto. Now, the ultimate pace is basically an average of the qualifying and the race pace, and the race pace, as I said, includes sprint and feature races, but obviously it's given a higher weighting to the feature race. So our race pace is about 2 parts feature race, 1 part sprint race, and then I average it with the qualifying. Why do I do that? Because the race pace is changed by things such as safety cars, as drivers having fast pace but being caught in traffic, caught in dirty air, all this stuff. This always affects the race pace. For that, I feel it's not completely accurate. Whereas qualifying, unless there's a yellow flag or a red flag, qualifying is very, you can trust the results because they've had half an hour to set 1 lap, fastest lap possible. It's very reliable data, because I think qualifying data is more reliable than race pace data. I've given qualifying half and race pace half. I understand points are given out on Sunday. We want to know who the fastest drivers are, but I've already given a table showing the 10 fastest drivers in terms of feature race pace. Now we're going to look at overall pace. So that's how we calculate ultimate pace. And I think it's the most reliable piece of information, because you've got an element of sprint races, you've got an element of qualifying, and an element of the feature race. So it's an overall picture. You could call it overall pace. I've chosen ultimate pace. Maybe the name is a little bit incorrect, but let's go with it. So compared to the fastest driver, Luke Browning's in his 3 qualifying sessions is 0.9 of a second off qualifying. He's come in mid-season, so it's not easy. His race pace per lap is a bit better. It's 0.744 of a second off, and so his ultimate pace is in the middle. He's about 0.8 of a second off, but it's a decent starting point. Coming to Oliver Goethe, he stepped in for the last 4 races. He's done a decent job, I think, considering that this is one of those late season call-ups. He's qualified 0.7 roughly off the ultimate pace set by Bortoleto, and his race pace is about a half a second off. So over the season, he's about 6.5 slower than Bortoleto, but he's been dropped in mid-season. Overall, he's in the 18th fastest driver. John Bennett has been late in the season. His qualifying pace is rather slow. He's 1.6 seconds slower, and his race pace is a lot faster, under a second. and his ultimate pace is about 1.2 seconds a lap slower than the fastest driver, and his race position is 27th. But that's a very good from a driver that has skipped F3 entirely, hasn't even done Formula Regional. He's from GB3, and he's flying the flag high for that series, and he's going to be driving in 2025. So a decent effort. He's more, when you looked at John Bennett, like his qualifying's a bit slow, his race pace is a lot faster, whereas Max Esterson has been very much qualifying race. He's about 1.35 seconds slower every lap, and he's the 29th fastest driver. Dino Beganovic did the last 2 rounds. He was driving for Dams. His qualifying average is 0.121 of a second. That is amazing. In those 2 rounds, he's really put himself back on the map. His ultimate pace is under 0.2 of a second slower, and his ultimate pace position is 5th. I think that's reinvigorated his place in the Ferrari Driver Academy, and he's one to watch next year. So hopefully High Tech can give him a car where he can fight for a championship. Now, I think I made a mistake because I said pace position, Max Esterson 29th, but I think it's 28th. Shane Shields is 29th. On average, he's about 2.5 seconds slower. And Niels Coulin is more than 3.5 seconds slower. He's the slowest driver across the 2024 F2 season, and his qualifying pace is more than 4 seconds a lap slower. So these 2 drivers, especially Niels Coulin, are not on the level of driver that should be in Formula 2. Also, I wanted to mention that I'm not including any results for Gabriele Mini or Leonardo Fornaroli. These 2 drivers did not do enough races to really calculate their data. I think you should do at least 2 rounds. That way you've got 2 sprint races, 2 feature races, 2 qualifying sessions. That's good data. Next, we've got Amaury Cordeel. Now, for the drivers that started the season and did the first 10 races, including Taylor Barnard, Franco Colapinto, I've got some more numbers here. So in qualifying, Amaury Cordeel is about 0.8 of a second slower, and in race pace he's a 1.1 seconds slower, and his ultimate pace is about bang on a second slower every lap compared to the fastest driver. His standard deviation every lap is 1.3 seconds. So sometimes, now the standard deviation is like, here's your average speed. How far do you deviate from it? So a small standard deviation would be like this. You're keeping it very accurate, close to that midpoint. And a high standard deviation will be somewhere here. You're going a long way from your average. Now, in ultimate pace, he's 0.9 of a second slower than Paul Aron, and it's his 3rd season. This data doesn't tell the full story. I think he did a reasonable job, keeping the car on the road and picking up feature race points. He has done that, but 0.9 of a second is quite a big gap. Now, coming to Juan Manuel Correa, maybe the perception is that he's slow, and he is a little bit, but he's not as slow. Like, if you look at his pace, he's almost 0.3 of a second faster every lap than Amaury Cordeel. He's about 3/4 of a second slower in qualifying, 0.7 slower in the race. He's a bit under half a second a lap slower than Jack Crawford, and his deviation is less than a second, so not too bad from Juan Manuel Correa. I suppose it's a shame he didn't finish the season, but it was good to see Beganovic in the car. Roman Stanek has had a poor season. Now, as I said, I'm not sold on the Trident car. He's 8.5 tenths off in qualifying. And in the race, he's about a second and a half slower. He's 26th in terms of pace, slower than drivers like Cordeel and Correa. So that's a little bit of a surprise. And he's 3/4 of a second slower than Richard Verschoor. And his standard deviation is fairly high, meaning it's not that accurate, but sometimes he's a lot faster, as we've seen in the Melbourne Sprint race. Enzo Fittipaldi. Now, this is where I have to say this season is quite tight in terms of the speed of the driver. So he's in 15th place, and he's just over half a second slower every lap than the fastest driver. Drove for Van Amersfoort, did the first 12 races. He's almost half a second faster than Rafael Villagomez. His standard deviation is pretty good. So they're good numbers, and to see a driver that's about half a second a lap slower than the fastest driver in 15th position on pace is quite a surprise. It tells you how tight this year was. So remember before I said things like, 3 drivers had 40% of all feature race podiums. What this is telling me is that even though certain drivers were dominating in terms of points, podiums, and all that sort of thing, the other drivers are fairly close in terms of pace, but the positions aren't changing as much as people think. Next is Joshua Dirksen. Now, despite finishing top 10 in the championship, he's 17th on pace. He's about 6/10 of a second slower in all the metrics, although he's a tenth and a half faster than Taylor Barnard. His standard deviation is a little bit high, but I think a lot of that's to do with the AIX car. It's a very big step up from Joshua Dirksen from Formula Regional up to Formula 2. He's handled it very well. You could almost say he's the surprise of the season. Next is Villagomez. He's about a second a lap slower. He's in 25th place in terms of pace. He's the slowest of the regular drivers, and he's about half a second slower than Enzo Fittipaldi. His standard deviation is not too high. But again, like Amaury Cordeel, he was quite good at keeping the car on the road and picking up points in the feature race, just staying the course. It's not too bad from Villagomez. Taylor Barnard. Now, as for Taylor Barnard, he's very good in qualifying, and the race pace, he's 1.2 seconds slower. So it puts him about 9/10 off the ultimate pace, 9/10 off in the ultimate pace, and he's a tenth and a half slower than Dirksen, and his standard deviation is quite high. So that means there's a lot of variations. So some races he's really quick, and some races he's been really slow. I don't think this is a true reflection of Taylor Barnard. When he's been in Formula 3 and Formula 2, he's always had like one of the worst cars. I think AIX was one of the worst teams in terms of their setup or where they were with their car. He's done a decent job, and unfortunately we lost him mid-season. I think it's also worth pointing out that AIX seemed to improve over the season. They were quite quick at the end of the year, and he's missed out on the faster car that Dirksen had to get those wins. So it's a case of what might have been, but he has a future in Formula E. Ratomo Miyata is 19th fastest driver. His pace is not too bad. In qualifying trim, he's about 2/3 of a second slower, and his race pace is almost 8/10. So averaging it out, he's about 7/10 of a second a lap slower. but he has a reasonable standard deviation. His gap to Maloney is 0.375 of a second, so there's time to be made up. He's obviously struggled to adjust to the European circuits, but hopefully he does better in his second year. But he's not really slow. He just needs to find a few tenths of a second, and I think we'll see him go further up the grid. Next is Pepe Marti with a slightly disappointing season. He's about 6 tenths of a lap slower. A decent size standard deviation, so sometimes he's faster, sometimes he's slower. And he's 4 tenths of a second a lap slower than Hadjar. That's not a good season. I'm not entirely sure where it went wrong for Pepe Marti. I'm not sure what happened with the Campos car either. I don't think it was the best car this season. And then Zach O'Sullivan has had a bit of an up and down year. He's quite good in qualifying, 4 tenths of a second off, and he's about 4.5 tenths slower every lap. But his gap to Victor Martins is almost 3 tenths. He's a very low standard deviation, so he's very much the sort of driver that's very much in the same place all the time. But he's, I think a lot of that's to do with the ART not really nailing their race pace of their car, because you have to think about in 2023, Zach O'Sullivan was second in the standings, and say Paul Aaron was third, Colapinto was fourth. So why is O'Sullivan all of a sudden so much slower than Paul Aaron and Franco Colapinto? So I think ART has struggled, especially with race pace. And some races it looked like they were struggling with tyre degradation. I think if Zach O'Sullivan could have gotten a more competitive car, we'd have seen more from him. Let's see what the future holds from him. But obviously a great win in Monaco. Richard Verschoor has driven for 2 teams. The last 2 teams he drove for MP. So on average he's 7 tenths of a second faster than his teammates, which is not unexpected because he's very experienced. His standard deviation is also very small, and he's about 3 to 3.5 tenths of a second slower, but he hasn't had the best car. As I said, Trident, no, I'm almost certain they're not the best car this season. They're one of the slowest. So I think that's very good from Richard Verschoor. Zane Maloney, 9th, which is disappointing because he started the season so well. Here we see him celebrating his win at Bahrain, but his qualifying's 3 tenths of a second a lap slower. And even though he's faster than his teammate Miata, you've got to look at that standard deviation. Notice how Richard Verschoor was under half a second in his standard deviation. Zane Maloney is 0.646 of a second. So that means sometimes he's going really well, like he did at Monza and Bahrain. Other times he's really slow, like the Imola feature race, like Baku. That's really impacted him, and I think there's missed opportunity. I'm not entirely convinced of Rodin either as a team. I don't see them trending upwards during the season, but it's a decent effort. But for him to be 9th on pace after the first weekend is disappointing. I think it's a shame that we don't see him in Formula 1 get a chance. That's how it goes. Oliver Bearman is next. He's 12th on pace. Considering where he's been during the season, that's reasonable. But the gap to Antonelli is less than 1/10 of a second. That's something he can take away. He's fairly close to his teammate. And although his teammate's a rookie and he's younger, he's highly, highly rated. So Bearman's about 4 tenths of a second slower Maybe some of that's down to Prema's race pace, or sometimes his qualifying honestly wasn't that strong. So it's a bit car, maybe it's a bit driver, maybe it's at a topsy-turvy season. Sometimes he's in F1, sometimes he's in F2. I think the data there says that there's speed. The speed is there, but I think it hasn't been fully realised. Then we come to Jack Crawford. I think this is disappointing from Crawford. Remember how he was like almost half a second faster than Correa, but when you factor in Beganovic and his two races, that gap comes down to 3/10. So I think Beganovic clearly had a pace advantage over Jack Crawford. Considering the experience gap, that's quite shocking. And considering he finished 5th in the championship, the fact that he's 10th in pace position is quite bad. His qualifying is letting him down. He's 4/10 off. His race pace is under 3/10. If he can improve his qualifying, he might be a challenger for the 2025 season. Victor Martins, where did it all go wrong? We're going to talk about that. In qualifying, he's less than a 10th off the fastest driver, and he's 2/10 of a second a lap slower in race pace. His ultimate pace is just over a 10th slower than the fastest driver, and his standard deviation is also low. And he's 4/10 faster than O'Sullivan and Browning. He's third in terms of his overall pace, considering where I think the ART has struggled with their car, probably more so than Prema, especially in the race pace. That's a little bit like missed opportunity. I think it's a great job from Victor Martins to be showing that sort of speed. But the potential wasn't realised. Antonelli, on the other hand, is qualifying. Now, another factor that I haven't mentioned is age, right? So Antonelli is the youngest driver here, born in August 2006. So you have to see if he's qualifying less than 2/10, and if you give him, he's about 2 years younger than Bortoleto. So in 2 years' time, he'll more than make up that 0.172. The race pace, as I said, I'm not sold on Prema's race pace, but their qualifying pace is good. He's had a 10th over his teammates Behrman and Meni. Standard deviation is very good, considering such a young, inexperienced driver to have a standard deviation less than half a second. That's very good. His ultimate pace position of 7th is very good. He's not the standout driver of the season, but considering how young he is, the lack of experience, I think he's done an excellent job. Koshmini, slightly disappointing. It's a tale of two halves for him. His qualifying is 2/10 off the fastest driver, which is his teammate. So he's one of the fastest qualifiers, but in race pace, he's 2/3 of a second slower. His ultimate pace per lap is over 4/10, and so his racecraft needs work. His standard deviation is not too high, but higher than the top drivers. So I think coming back to Koshmini, I think the Invicta car had a very good, very fast car in qualifying. Now, Paul Aaron, he's the second fastest driver over the season. He's 1/10 off the fastest driver, but that's split between almost equaling him in qualifying and being almost 2/10 slower than him in the race pace. So that's a bit surprising, because I think in qualifying trim that Invicta was the fastest car. In race pace, maybe that's a bit of an issue, but he's the second fastest driver, and not only in overall race pace but also feature race pace. So very strong season. Be nice to see him in Formula One. Standard deviation's a little bit higher than the other front-running drivers. I think we know why. Weekends like Silverstone, Hungary didn't help him. And here we are, the fastest driver across the season. So he's qualifying. He's the fastest qualifier, fastest race pace. His gap to Kushmini is 4/10. His standard deviation is less than half a second. He's been very accurate. His racecraft is excellent, and I think he grew as a driver during the season. The last two events at Qatar and Abu Dhabi really impressed me. This is the driver you really should be watching amongst the rookies going into next season in F1. Isaac Hadjar finished second in the standings, but he's fourth here on pace. He's almost 2/10 off Bortoleto in his ultimate pace. The standard deviation is high for a front runner. Notice it's almost 3/10 of a second, so that's not always a bad thing. That means on his day, he's actually faster than Bortoleto, but on his good day. But on his off day, he's a lot slower. And his gap to Marty is 4/10. It's a reasonable result from Isaac Hadjar, but the data's telling me that Paul Aron is a faster driver. But again, I'm not totally sold on Campos as a team. They've never been a top team. Not sure about their qualifying or, their car. I mean, think about it. Last year, Pepe Marti is right there with Paul Aron, with Franco Colapinto, and this year he's so far behind. It doesn't 100% add up. So I think Campos doesn't have the best car. Maybe Hadjar's done a really good job. It's hard to say because I think the teams are very close, but I think Campos is about 1/10 of a second slower than some of the other top teams, like especially in race pace, not in qualifying pace. Actually, their starter's not bad, 3/10 of a second a lap slower, but he's slower than Hauger. There's obviously a big experience gap, though they're actually a very similar age, Hauger and Colapinto. MP is probably not the best team, but according to that data we saw earlier, they are one of the best teams this season, probably the third best team, so they're still very fast, especially in qualifying from Colapinto, 8th fastest driver. Hauger's the 6th fastest driver. He's got a very small edge over Colapinto and Goethe, which I think is quite poor considering the experience gap. But he's still fairly young. His qualifying is excellent, but he's fluffed it in the races. He's gone out in the first lap in Barcelona, and then he's thrown away a potential win in Australia. So I don't know where did it all go wrong for Dennis Hauger, but his pace is clearly there, but it hasn't materialised into concrete results except for Saudi Arabia. And lastly, Christian Mansell is about a second a lap slower. He's faster in the races than in the qualifying. He's done a decent job for Trident. Because he's only done a couple of races, no standard deviation teammate comparison, but excellent work from Christian Mansell. So coming into the 2024 F2 season, there were two clear favourites for the title, and as we know, those expectations did not play out. Now, why is that, and what happened to our two championship favourites? We look here that Victor Martins has finished 7th in the championship. In the first half of the season, he scored very little points. He's had a sprint race win. Oliver Beeman's had a very tough season, finished outside the top 10 in the final point standings. but he's had 3 sprint race wins. So let's look. Where did it all go wrong for Victor Martins? Well, let's have a look at race by race. Now, in my data that I've looked at, Victor Martins was the 3rd fastest driver over the course of the season. So it's hard to understand why he's 7th in the standings. He was the fastest driver over the course of the 2023 season, but he's 5th in the standings, and this year it got worse for him. I do think that ART haven't produced the best car, but let's have a look. In the first qualifying session in Bahrain, he's behind Zach O'Sullivan. In the feature race, he's had a mechanical failure on lap 17. So it's a poor start. He's qualified 4th, which is strong for Jeddah. Became 3rd when Behrman went to Ferrari. In the feature race, he's finished 11th. I suppose I know that the Saudi Arabia feature race was full of a lot of safety cars. I'm assuming he got caught up in that somehow. He's had a clash with Paul Aaron and lost 10th place. In Melbourne, Australia, he's crashed in qualifying. And he started at the back of the grid. He started on the back row in the sprint race, and he started on the back row in the feature race, and he's recovered to 8th place in the feature race. So that, I think that's indicative of the underlying pace that Victor Martins had, that he was able to recover from the back row. In the Imola round, for some reason, maybe he had a mechanical problem. When in the last part of the qualifying session, when the other drivers are doing their fastest laps, Victor Martins is in the pits. He's unable to set a representative lap. So once again, he's starting at the back, and he recovered from last place on the grid to 9th in the feature race. That's not bad at a circuit that's difficult to overtake, like Imola. He's then put it on the front row for Monaco. In the sprint race, he has a first corner collision, and in the feature race, his car basically stalls off the line. He has a very slow getaway, and he somehow finishes 9th, but that's not a lot of points. And then he has more trouble in Barcelona. Despite winning the sprint race, he's qualified 9th, which by his lofty standards is a bit disappointing. And then on the opening lap into the first corner, Dennis Hauger runs into him. So the opening 6 race weekends have all been disastrous one way or another, and a lack of pace is not the main issue, although the ART doesn't look as fast this year. He had an excellent weekend at Hungary, and then his misery continued again at Spa-Francorchamps. He had a mechanical failure in qualifying, so he had to start both races from the back of the grid. And then in the feature race, on the 3rd lap, he's just minding his own business, and Rafael Villagomez spins around and spears into the side of him. So the opening 10 race weekends, except for 2 rounds, basically Silverstone and Hungary, except for those 2 races, it's been a disaster show for Victor Martins. A lot of it's just bad luck, mechanical problems, some of it's driver error. He did crash in Melbourne by his own accord. I think the underlying pace of Victor Martins himself is there. It's showing up in the data, but the ability to have a clean race weekend, to claim the position, the points that he would like, has escaped for whatever reason. I'm not sure what's wrong with the ART car, but when you look at the data, like when you see Zach O'Sullivan be, a lot slower than Kush Miney, you think, well, whatever you can say about Zach O'Sullivan, I don't think he's slower than Kush Miney over a lap. So maybe the ART car is not quite where it needs to be, especially in qualifying pace. It's putting Victor Martins on the back foot. And as I said, mechanical failure in the opening race of the year, mechanical failure in qualifying in Imola and Spa-Francorchamps, opening lap collisions, some problem in Monaco off the grid in the last 4 rounds of the year. If we look at the overall championship picture, you look at the last 4 rounds. So looking at from Monza onwards, he's had 2 podiums and a further 3 top 6 finishes. He still had a rough weekend. Like, I don't know what happened to him in Qatar. He was in the points running, and then I think he's on the reverse strategy on soft tyres, and they went off in the sprint race. And then in the feature race again, just more trouble for Victor Martins. He's finished decently with a 4th place. Now for part 2. Where did it all go wrong for Oliver Bearman? I think Oliver Bearman's problems are a lot more straightforward than Victor Martins' problems. Firstly, let's go back to the race by race. So in the Bahrain weekend, Prema are off the pace, that's for sure. That is without a doubt one of the slowest teams there, but he struggles with it more than Antonelli. He's crashed into the AIX car, I believe it's Joshua Dirksen. So that's not really a good weekend from him. He answers that with a pole position in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and then he gets a call up to Formula One. So that's 25 points possibly on the table there that would have shot him up the championship order and made it worth fighting for him. Now, then we go to Melbourne, and while Kimi Antonelli's on the front row, he's back in 16th, 1.8 seconds off the pole time. I think he's caught up with Jack Crawford's crash. A yellow flag, couldn't set a time. He hasn't looked quick though in the races, but he's at least recovered to 9th place. It's like a bit of misfortune due to the timing of the yellow flag. It's a bit of a lack of pace. Antonelli was there, almost made it on the podium. So it's tough. And then we go to Imola. He's on the front row of the grid, scores points in the sprint race. And then in the feature race, he's competing for the win. And he stalls during his pit stop. Now, people might want to say that's driver error, and it could very well be driver error, but it seems to happen a lot in Formula 2 that these cars are not stable. So I think this is the 4th race of the year. So to me, it's a matter of, he's missed Saudi Arabia. There's potentially a lot of points on the board there, and he's potentially lost a win or a 2nd place. At worst, he would have been 3rd in Imola. So potentially like more than 40 points gone just there, and he's probably lost motivation to fight too hard for the championship, knowing there's going to be in Formula One. He's scraped the wall in qualifying in Monaco. He's recovered to 4th place in the feature race, so that's a very impressive result. In Barcelona, people can blame the car, but he's a long way behind Antonelli. He's more than 4 tenths slower than him in qualifying. He had no pace in the sprint race or the feature race. and you have to. And in the feature race, he's finished behind Antonelli. I think Antonelli went to the back of the grid because he stalled on the formation lap. See what I mean with these cars? It's very easy to stall. It's a very common theme. In Austria, he won the sprint race, and in the feature race, his engine failed in the feature race. So that's more issues. Now, at this point, people will be like, well, Formula 2's illegitimate. I don't think it's illegitimate. You just have to understand what's going on. Obviously, I don't think it means that the driver winning the race or winning the championship is somehow unworthy. I think it's very unreasonable to suggest that. Had a terrible weekend in Belgium. He's qualified well behind Antonelli. He's crashed into Pepe Marti on the opening, going into the first corner. Monza was an improvement. Won the sprint race. Baku wasn't even there. So when you look at that, you can understand why Oliver Bearman hasn't fought for the championship. I think he was put on the back foot at the start of the year. I don't think he was expecting the Prema car to be that slow, and he's struggled with it. He struggled with the car at the start of the season. He's missed a round. Then he's had a bad qualifying in Australia because of a yellow flag. His clutch failed on him when he's in the pits. So I think it's just put him on the back foot. Maybe somewhere he lost motivation. He knew he was getting a Formula One drive, so it became less important to him as the year went on. And just the odd good race proved that, I've got it. So we'll see, of course, going into the next year in Formula One, how he does. Going about Prema just in general, thing about Prema this year, I feel as though they have a couple of, what can I call them? Couple of green young men. Antonelli is, very young. He's only 17 and a half at the start of the year. Bearman was 18 at the start of the year. I think there's a little bit of disrespect towards Frederick Vesti, the job that he did in 2023. I think he did an excellent job. He made the car look fast. Maybe his setups were helpful to Oliver Bearman. I can't say for sure, but it seems something like that, whereas when you come to this season, having those two inexperienced drivers seems to have counted against Prema in the search for that sweet spot, the setup. And then when you had rain or you had something that the normal pace of the car to be less important, like whatever was going on in Budapest, then suddenly we see Antonelli fly up the order. So I think there's pace there. I think there's a lot of talent there. I don't think it's entirely Prema's fault. I don't think the car is as bad as it's been made out to be. I think a lot of people are disappointed the way that this year's championship went. They felt as though certain drivers, particularly Oliver Bearman, weren't being portrayed as favourably as they should be, and that's been a draw of a lot of criticism. And I have to say the engine's breaking down. Okay, I think that happens. I think if you watch a motor racing series and you've seen someone have a couple of engine failures, you have to mentally take that into account when you look at the final results of the season. You can't just expect that to be taken into account for you. And I think motor racing fans should be doing that. Should say, okay, well, it's like Paul Aaron, right? I feel as though he's a distant third in the championship, but if you take into account, what happened to him in Belgium, like he completed almost the whole race, and on the last lap his car breaks down out of a podium position. Like that's 15 sure points out of the window, 15 guaranteed points lost. And even then, that's, to me, that's a perfect example. So if I'm looking at the final standings in Formula 2 this year, like mentally I'm saying, well, 163 for Paul Aaron, yeah, but it really is 178. He really should have been on that podium in Belgium, and that's completely out of his control. And who knows what would have happened in Monza, because he was punted out at the first corner. These are the sort of mental notes I think motor racing fans should take into account. And for whatever reason, I think Behrman and Martins were put on the back foot at the start of the year, and it's not easy to overcome that and go and win a title. I'm not sure if Prema have had a handle on the new car as much as they should have, but if they're on an equal footing with the other teams, that's not a bad thing. Because if I'm being honest, I think back in 2016, 2017, maybe even after that, that Prema car, that Prema team, their car was clearly ahead of the pack. That car was clearly in a league of its own, especially in those early years. They were very fast. I don't think it's good for one team to have such a clear advantage. And I think this was a good Formula 2 season because there wasn't a team that had that clear advantage. And at the end of the day, the drivers had to make the difference. So Gabriel Bortoleto has made the difference. So, he's just plugged away, getting the valuable points, not making silly errors. What he did at Qatar and Yas Marina, especially Qatar, he was sensational there. If I'm being honest, no matter what happened, the Qatar feature race, Gabriel Bortoleto, driver of the season for me. Driver of the season, to hold the nerve when he's got to drive through all the traffic of the drivers that haven't stopped yet. He's got Paul Aaron trying to overtake him every corner. Like, that's a lot of pressure. One mistake, one getting hit by one back marker, that's it. It's all over. Hadjar would be champion, and he just held on. To me, that's the driver of the season, and I think this is what we want to see. We want to see championships being decided like that and not being decided by, he's got the Prema car and it's faster, a lot of wins. Okay, that's great. Where's the competition? We need more competition for the drivers, and it's good if there's a more level playing field amongst the cars. I think it's been a good thing. Some drivers have handled it better than others. And as I said, Gabriel Bortoleto has absolutely been the best driver this season. There's no doubt about that. Some other drivers have been fast, or other drivers were fast here, and they had an off period. But Gabriel Bortoleto's been on it the whole time. There's other standout drivers. I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, so my top 5 drivers of the season. So in this part of the video, just imagine someone's got a gun to my head. Okay, F2 Fan 5000, you have to pick the 5 best drivers of 2024. Be honest with me. I've got a gun to your head. Okay. So I already said it. Bortoleto, number 1, a clear number 1. And I put Paul Aaron in second because, well, the data says he's the second fastest driver. His pole positions have shown the underlying pace of the driver, but he's had some mistakes in him. He's had some bad luck. So for me, Paul Aaron is second, and Maloney has to be. Isaac Hadjar has to be third. Those 3 drivers have basically been the class of the field, and as I said, I'm not 100% convinced on Campos as a team to compete with someone like Prema or obviously the ahead of Prema this year, but at least Hadjar's ahead of the Prema drivers. But I'm not convinced of them, and I think Invicta is a better team. Operationally, we've seen errors from them, most notably in Hungary and Baku. I don't think you see those sort of strange errors, not getting a driver out into track on time and having those brake failures. I don't think you see that from Prema. No matter what happened this year, you don't see that from Prema, from ART, from Invicta. Those three teams are always on it. So for his 4 feature race wins and for being a contender, you have to put Hadjar there. But I'll put him third because I think the amount of races where he didn't have pace, that percentage of races is higher than, say, Paul Aaron. Paul Aaron might have had a couple of race weekends like Silverstone and Hungary, but generally he's had pace. But I've seen races where Hadjar didn't have pace. So I think those three are obvious. Now my surprise here is going to be Dino Beganovic. He's going to be my number 4. Now, I know he's only done 2 race weekends, but he's made such an impression. This is a driver that's been on the back foot. It's been on the ropes. He struggled to make the impression that he hoped to make in Formula 3. He's hoping to win that series, and he only finished 6 2 years in a row. He's stepped into that dams. He's dominated Jack Crawford. His data says he's one of the fastest drivers of the season in those 2 race weekends, which includes 4 races and 2 qualifying sessions. So, yeah, very rarely you see a junior driver turn their career around so convincingly in such a short amount of time. But this is the point, right? Motor racing, things change quickly. Now, you got the gun to my head, remember? Top 5. Okay, I've got my top 4. Okay, and I want to put Antonelli. He's very fast. He's shown a lot of promise. But I think, should I put Victor Martins? What a great comeback, in the second half of the season. He was out of the top 10. He's recovered to 7th. And I think about Richard Verschoor, he's had all those podiums towards the end of the year. He's had, since Spa, he's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 podiums in the last 5 rounds. It's amazing. He's been excellent. But I have to say, my number 5th on my top 5, it has to be Joshua Dirksen. That AIX team was nowhere last year. When we had Josh Mason, Brad Benavides, Roy Nissany, they didn't score a point. And then he's come in this year. Everyone said he's a pay driver. No one rated him. He's just, he's paying his way. Back of the grid team. They're not going to score any points, or maybe the odd point. What's the point of him doing it? And he's gone there and he's finished in the top 10 in the Drivers' Championship. A feature race win. No safety cars to help him, just on merit. At the last race, he's had podiums. He's put that team up where it doesn't belong. I think that's fantastic by Joshua Dirksen. When you consider the AIX team, for him to have done what he did in the second half of the season, that's fantastic. Fantastic. So, they're my top 5 drivers of the season. 5, Dirksen. 4, Beganovic. 3, Hadjar. 2, Aaron. And by a decent margin, the best driver of 2024, Gabriel Bortoleto.